A maid's daughter spotted what the lawyers and even the judge missed, saving a CEO from a $750 million scam. A single clause, a single signature, and a single mistake that nearly cost an honest man everything. Billionaire Robert Harrison was about to lose his company and his reputation over a single clause in a contract. Your Honor, it's a clerical error, the defense pleaded. $750 million is no error, the opposing lawyer snapped. And in the silence that followed, a soft, trembling voice whispered, "That's the wrong clause." What no lawyer, no judge, not even the accused himself had noticed, a 13-year-old girl saw in an instant. One detail so small it was invisible, until it wasn't. That detail exposed a scheme designed to strip a man of his fortune, his reputation, and his future. What started as a simple contract dispute ended as a battle against a hidden conspiracy. This is the story of how a maid's daughter uncovered the truth and changed everything. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A single piece of paper could ruin a good man's life. 13-year-old Grace sat on a hard wooden bench, feeling smaller than ever. The vast, echoing courtroom smelled of old paper and stale coffee, a place where whispers turned into judgments and lives were weighed on scales of justice. Why had her mother insisted she come today? Her mother, Susan, stood by the heavy oak doors, her hands clutching a worn handbag. She was a maid in the grand house of Mr. Robert Harrison, the man now sitting at the defendant's table. His face, usually so kind and quick to smile, was pale and drawn. He looked like a man watching his world crumble to dust. Susan's loyalty to him was fierce. Mr. Harrison had paid for Grace's grandfather's medical bills, never once making them feel like a charity case. He was a good man, she always said, and good men deserved help when they were in trouble. Across the room, a man named Mr. Michael Fletcher sat beside his lawyer, looking perfectly calm. He was Mr. Harrison's business partner. Or he was. Now, he was the one accusing Mr. Harrison of fraud. Fletcher's smile was thin and sharp, like a crack in ice. He occasionally glanced over at Mr. Harrison, not with anger, but with a look of cold, calculated victory. Grace didn't like his eyes. They were like a snake's, still and watchful. The judge, a stern-faced woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, peered down from her high bench. Her name was Judge Thompson. She looked tired, as if she had heard every lie the world had to offer and was no longer surprised by any of them. "Mr. Davies," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, addressing Mr. Harrison's lawyer. "Do you have any further evidence to present?" Mr. Davies, a young lawyer with kind but worried eyes, stood up. His suit seemed a little too big for him, as if he had shrunk with the weight of the case. "Your Honor, we maintain that this is a misunderstanding, a clerical error. My client, Mr. Harrison, has been a pillar of the business community for 30 years. He would never knowingly defraud his own company." Fletcher's lawyer, a man whose name Grace had already forgotten, scoffed. It was a soft sound, but in the quiet room, it sounded like a tearing cloth. "A clerical error to the tune of $750 million? Your Honor, the contract is perfectly clear. Clause 17B, Mr. Harrison signed it. His signature is right there, clear as day." He gestured to a large screen displaying a scanned document. A thick, impenetrable wall of text. Grace watched her mother wring her hands. Susan had been a nervous wreck for weeks. She'd told Grace the basics. Mr. Harrison had signed a contract that gave Mr. Fletcher controlling interest in their company if certain profit targets weren't met. The company had missed those targets, narrowly. Now, Fletcher was taking everything. He claimed the contract was an insurance policy against failure. Mr. Harrison claimed the clause was never supposed to be in the final version. He said it was a remnant from an early, aggressive draft that both men had agreed to discard. But he had no proof. Only his word against Fletcher's. And the contract. The judge sighed. "Mr. Harrison, did you or did you not sign this document?" Robert Harrison stood up slowly. He was a tall man, but his shoulders were stooped. "I did, Your Honor. But I was assured by Mr. Fletcher that the document reflected our final verbal agreement. I trusted him. We've been partners for a decade." "Trust is not a legal defense," Fletcher's lawyer said smoothly. "The four corners of the document are all that matter." Grace fidgeted. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her mother had to work a second job in the evenings, and there was no one to watch her. So, she'd been brought along with strict instructions. Stay quiet, be invisible. But Grace wasn't good at being invisible. Not when something felt wrong. And this felt deeply, horribly wrong. She had an unusual hobby for a 13-year-old girl. While other kids were playing video games or scrolling through social media, Grace read. But not just storybooks. She read anything she could get her hands on. History books, biographies, and most of all, she read the books left behind by her great-grandfather, Sergeant Thomas Riley. He wasn't just a war veteran. He was a legend, a codebreaker, a man who saw patterns no one else could. He had fought in a war of secrets and whispers, a war won not with guns, but with wits. His small house, where Grace and her mother now lived, was a library of his life. Books on cryptography, on logic, on the history of language. He had taught her to look past the surface of things. The devil isn't in the details, Gracie, he used to say, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. The devil is in what the details are trying to hide. He had passed away 2 years ago, but his voice was still clear in her head. Right now, it was telling her to look. To really look. Her eyes fixed on the screen displaying the contract. It was a sea of black and white text. Legal jargon. Words designed to confuse, to trap. The lawyers had looked at it. The judge had looked at it. Mr. Harrison had certainly looked at it, though probably not closely enough. What had they all missed? Unless you have concrete evidence that the defendant was coerced or that this document is a forgery, I'm afraid I have no choice but to. Judge Thompson began, her voice heavy with finality. Wait. A small voice cut through the room. Every head turned. The voice was quiet, but it was as sharp and clear as a bell. It had come from the back of the courtroom. It had come from Grace. Susan's face went white. She grabbed her daughter's arm, her fingers digging in. Grace, what are you doing? Hush. But it was too late. Judge Thompson's gaze fell upon her, her eyebrows raised in a mixture of annoyance and surprise. Who said that? Who is this child? Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. Every eye in the room was on her. Mr. Fletcher was staring at her, his mask of calm slipping to reveal a flash of irritation. His lawyer looked amused. Mr. Harrison and his lawyer, Mr. Davies, just looked confused. Grace stood up, her legs feeling like jelly. She was just a girl in a simple blue dress, with blonde hair tied back in a ponytail. She knew how she looked. Insignificant. A child who had spoken out of turn. I'm sorry, Your Honor, she said, her voice trembling slightly, but she forced it to be steady. My name is Grace Riley. My mother works for Mr. Harrison. The judge's expression did not soften. And what, Miss Riley, could you possibly have to say that 2 teams of highly paid lawyers in this court have overlooked? There was a ripple of quiet laughter from Fletcher's side of the room. Grace's cheeks burned, but she thought of her great-grandfather. Dignity is a fortress, he had written in one of his journals. Do not let the words of small men breach its walls. She took a deep breath and looked directly at the judge. That's the wrong clause. The laughter stopped. The judge stared at her, her head tilted. I beg your pardon. The clause, Grace repeated, pointing a small, steady finger at the giant screen. Clause 17b. Everyone is looking at the words. But you're not looking at the punctuation. Fletcher's lawyer stood up, a condescending smile on his face. Your Honor, this is absurd. Must we indulge the legal theories of a schoolgirl? I'll be the judge of what is absurd in my courtroom. Thank you, Judge Thompson said sharply, her eyes still fixed on Grace. She was intrigued now. This was not the outburst of a bored child. There was a strange confidence in the girl's eyes. Continue, Miss Riley. What about the punctuation? Grace felt a surge of courage. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but her great-grandfather's voice was louder. Look for the flaw in the design. Every system, every code, every lie has a flaw. The contract is written in American English. Grace began, her voice growing stronger. The spelling, the grammar, it's all standard. The date is formatted month, day, year. The dollar signs are for US dollars. Your point being? The judge asked, leaning forward slightly. My point is the quotation marks, Grace said. She wished she had a pointer. Look at clause 17b. There's a direct quote in the middle of it, attributed to a financial regulation. The quotation marks are logical, not typographical. A confused silence filled the room. Mr. Davies, Harrison's lawyer, was squinting at the screen, a frown on his face. He didn't understand. "Explain what that means," the judge commanded. "Typographical quotation marks are the curly ones," Grace said, her hands trying to draw the shape in the air. "The ones that look like a 66 and a 99. That's the standard in American typesetting. It has been for over a century. But logical quotation marks, they look different. They're straight, like little vertical lines. They're a relic. They come from typewriters." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But that's not the only place they come from. They are also the default in most European and Asian word processing software. Specifically, software that uses a different coding base. The rest of this document, all 47 pages, uses standard American-style curly quotes. But not this clause. This one clause, this one single paragraph in the middle of a massive document, uses a different formatting. It's subtle. Most people would never notice. But it's there." Fletcher's lawyer let out a short, nervous laugh. "This is semantics. A conspiracy theory about punctuation. Your Honor, she's wasting our time." But Judge Thompson was no longer looking at him. She was looking at Michael Fletcher. Just for a second. Fletcher's calm expression hadn't changed, but a tiny muscle was twitching in his jaw. He was perfectly still, but it was the stillness of a predator that has just heard the snap of a twig behind it. "So, what are you suggesting, Miss Riley?" the judge asked, her voice quiet and serious. "I'm suggesting that clause wasn't written at the same time as the rest of the contract," Grace said, her voice ringing with certainty. "I think it was inserted later, copied and pasted from a different document, one that was written on a different computer, probably using different software. It's a digital forgery, not of the signature, but of the content. They didn't change the words, they just added them. But they didn't think to match the formatting. They didn't think anyone would be crazy enough to look at the shape of the quotation marks." The room was utterly silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Susan was staring at her daughter, her mouth half open in disbelief. Mr. Harrison had risen slightly from his chair, his eyes wide with a dawning hope. His lawyer, Mr. Davies, was now looking at his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard, his face a mask of intense concentration. Finally, Mr. Davies looked up from his computer, his face pale. He looked at the judge, then at Grace, then back at the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice hoarse with shock. She's right. I've just run a metadata analysis of the digital copy of the contract provided by the plaintiff. The document history shows multiple versions, which is normal, but there's a formatting anomaly logged in the metadata on the final version. A font encoding conflict. It was logged at 2:14 a.m. on the date the contract was signed, and the conflict is located in the exact paragraph of Clause 17b. He took a shaky breath. The source of the pasted text, the metadata, identifies the original software it came from. It wasn't the firm's standard word processor. It was a freeware program, one that's based on an open-source engine developed in Eastern Europe. All eyes in the courtroom now turned to Michael Fletcher. His mask of calm had finally shattered. His face was ashen. The twitch in his jaw was gone, replaced by a rigid clenching. He stared at Grace, his snake-like eyes now filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. He had been undone. Not by a team of expensive lawyers, not by a brilliant judge, but by a 13-year-old girl who knew the difference between a curly quote and a straight one. A girl who had learned from a wise old soldier to look for the devil not in the details, but in what the details were trying to hide. The judge's gavel came down with a crash that echoed like a thunderclap. "This court," she announced, her voice booming with a newfound authority, "will be taking a 1-hour recess. And when we return, Mr. Fletcher, I suggest you have a much better explanation than clerical error. We will also be launching a full forensic investigation into this document. The bailiff will escort Mr. Fletcher to a holding room. He is not to have contact with anyone." As two uniformed officers approached the plaintiff's table, Michael Fletcher shot one last venomous glare at Grace. It was a look that promised retribution, a look that said this was not over. But Grace didn't flinch. She simply stood her ground, the quiet, observant girl who had just saved a good man from a $750 million scam. She was her great-grandfather's legacy, a codebreaker in a world of lies. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of motion and sound. Reporters, who had been lazily taking notes on what seemed like an open-and-shut case, were now scrambling, shouting questions, their cameras flashing. Susan rushed to Grace, pulling her into a tight hug, her body trembling with a mixture of fear, relief, and overwhelming pride. "Oh, Gracie," she whispered into her daughter's hair. How did you know?" Grace hugged her back, burying her face in her mother's familiar scent of laundry soap and love. "Grandpa Thomas taught me," she said softly. "He said most people see what they expect to see. You have to learn to see what's really there." Across the room, Mr. Harrison was being embraced by his lawyer. Tears were streaming down the older man's face, not of sorrow, but of profound, bone-deep relief. He looked over the heads of the crowd, and his eyes met Grace's. He mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Grace gave a small, shy nod. She hadn't done it for thanks. She had done it because it was the right thing to do, because a good man was in trouble. The bailiffs let a stone-faced Michael Fletcher out of the courtroom. His sharp suit now seemed ill-fitting, his confident swagger gone. He was a man who had built a trap for another and had, through an impossible twist of fate, stepped into it himself. The silence that followed his departure was heavy with unspoken questions. How had a 13-year-old seen what no one else had? Judge Thompson beckoned a clerk to the bench, speaking in a low, urgent tone. Her eyes kept drifting to the back of the room, to the small girl with the blonde ponytail who was now the center of a storm. Mr. Davies, Harrison's lawyer, finally broke away from his client and made his way toward Grace and Susan. His earlier look of worry was replaced by one of pure, unadulterated awe. "Miss Riley," he began, his voice still shaky. I don't know what to say. I've been a lawyer for 15 years. I've looked at thousands of contracts. I never, not in a million years, would have thought to look for something like that." The metadata confirmed it. It was a perfect insertion. Seamless. Except for one tiny, microscopic detail. "It wasn't microscopic if you knew what to look for," Grace said quietly. Susan looked down at her daughter, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. She had always known Grace was smart, of course. The girl devoured books like other children devoured candy. But this was something else entirely. This was a different kind of intelligence. It was sharp, observant, and fearless. It was the intelligence of her grandfather, a man Susan had loved and respected, but had never fully understood. She was seeing him now, living and breathing in her daughter. "We need to go," Susan said, her protective instincts kicking in as the reporters started to close in, their questions becoming more insistent. She took Grace's hand and began to lead her toward the exit. As they stepped out of the courtroom and into the marble hallway, the full weight of what had just happened began to settle on Grace. Her legs felt weak again. She had spoken up. In a real court. In front of a real judge. She had accused a powerful man of a crime, and she had been right. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. But as they neared the main doors of the courthouse, a man in a dark, expensive suit stepped into their path. He was not one of the reporters. He had a cold, professional look about him. He was one of Fletcher's associates. Grace had seen him sitting behind him in court. "Miss Riley," he said, his voice low and smooth, but with an undercurrent of menace. "Mr. Fletcher is a very influential man. He doesn't take kindly to public humiliation, especially from a child." Susan pulled Grace behind her, her small frame rigid with defiance. "You stay away from my daughter." The man's lips curled into a semblance of a smile. It did not reach his eyes. "This isn't over," he said, his gaze fixed on Grace. "You were clever today, but cleverness can be a dangerous thing. I'd be careful if I were you." Without another word, he turned and walked away, melting into the bustling crowd. A chill went down Grace's spine that had nothing to do with the courthouse's air conditioning. The look in that man's eyes was the same look she had seen in Fletcher's. It was a promise. Susan's hand tightened on Grace's. "We're going home," she said, her voice firm. But as they walked out into the bright afternoon sun, Grace knew that something had shifted. The world felt different now, more dangerous. She had won the battle in the courtroom, but she had a terrible feeling that she had just started a much bigger war. She had exposed a hidden detail, but in doing so, she had exposed herself. And the people she had exposed were not the kind to forgive or forget. The ride home was a blur. Susan drove their old, rattling car with a grim focus, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She kept glancing at Grace in the passenger seat, then at the rearview mirror, as if expecting the man in the dark suit to suddenly appear behind them. The bustling city streets, usually a source of fascination for Grace with their endless parade of people and stories, now seemed menacing. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every person who glanced their way seemed to be watching them. They didn't speak. The silence in the car was thick with unspoken fear and 100 unanswered questions. What had Grace done? She had told the truth. She had saved a good man. But in doing so, she had painted a target on their backs. Her great-grandfather's books were filled with stories of heroes and spies, of people who did the right thing at great cost. But those were stories. This was real life. The man's threat echoed in her ears. Cleverness can be a dangerous thing. Their small house, inherited from Sergeant Riley, had never felt more like a sanctuary. It was a simple, two-bedroom bungalow, crammed with books and memories. The scent of old paper and dried lavender hung in the air, a familiar comfort. As soon as they were inside, Susan locked the door and bolted it, something she rarely did during the day. She finally turned to Grace, her face a mixture of awe and terror. "Grace, you have to promise me something," she said, her voice low and urgent. "You cannot do anything like that ever again. You cannot put yourself in danger." "But I had to, Mom," Grace insisted, her voice small but firm. "They were going to ruin Mr. Harrison. He's a good person. You always said so." "I know he is." Susan's voice cracked. She sank onto the worn armchair, her head in her hands. "But these people, they are not like us. They play by different rules. You saw that man. The way he looked at you. That wasn't just anger, Grace. That was something else. Something cold." Grace went to her mother, wrapping her small arms around her shoulders. "I'm sorry I scared you." Susan pulled her into a fierce embrace. "Oh, honey, you didn't just scare me. You terrified me. But you also. I've never been so proud in my entire life." She pulled back, holding Grace's face in her hands, her eyes searching her daughter's. "You have your great-grandfather's mind. I always knew it. But I don't know if that's a blessing or a curse." Later that evening, the phone rang. Susan answered it, her voice tense. After a moment, her expression softened. "Robert." "Yes, we're home. We're fine." "Yes, she's right here." She handed the phone to Grace. "It's Mr. Harrison." Grace took the receiver, her hands suddenly clammy. "Grace." Mr. Harrison's voice came through the line, thick with emotion. "I don't even know where to begin. How can I possibly thank you?" "You don't have to thank me, sir," Grace said quietly. "I'm just glad it worked." "It worked?" He chuckled, a wet, broken sound. "Grace, you did more than just work something. You performed a miracle. The DA's office has already been in contact with my lawyer. They're opening a criminal investigation against Fletcher. They're looking into everything. It turns out, this isn't the first time he's been accused of something like this, but he always managed to cover his tracks. Until now. Until you." He paused, and Grace could hear him take a deep, steadying breath. "My lawyers are astounded. They're calling you a prodigy. I just call you a lifesaver. You saved my company, Grace. My family's legacy. My reputation. Everything I've worked for my entire life. I'm glad I could help," was all Grace could manage to say. The praise felt strange, like a coat that was too big for her. "I want to do something for you," Mr. Harrison continued, his voice regaining its usual strength. "For you and your mother. Anything you want. A reward. A scholarship. A new house. You name it." Grace looked at her mother, who was watching her with worried eyes. She thought of their little house, filled with her great-grandfather's books. She thought of the life they had, simple but safe. Or, what used to be safe. "We don't need anything, Mr. Harrison. We're okay." "Nonsense," he insisted. "We'll talk more tomorrow. I'll have my driver pick you both up. We'll have a proper dinner. Please, allow me to do this." Grace hesitated. A part of her wanted to say no, to retreat back into the quiet anonymity of her life. But another part, the part that was her great-grandfather's kin, knew that retreating was not an option. Not anymore. "Okay, Mr. Harrison," she said. "We'll be ready." After she hung up, Susan fussed over her. "A reward? Grace, we can't take his money." "I know," Grace said. "But I think we need his help. Not his money. His help." The threat from Fletcher's man was a dark cloud on the horizon, and Grace understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that Mr. Harrison was a powerful ally. They were going to need one. The next day, a sleek black car, the kind Grace had only ever seen in movies, pulled up in front of their small house. The neighbors peeked through their curtains, their eyes wide with curiosity. A uniformed driver opened the door for them, and they were whisked away into a world of polished chrome and soft leather. Mr. Harrison lived in a house that looked more like a museum. It was grand and beautiful, filled with art and antiques. But it felt different from the cold penthouse where Ava, the girl from her mother's stories, had felt so out of place. This house felt like a home. There were pictures of Mr. Harrison's family on the walls, of his children and grandchildren. A friendly golden retriever padded over to greet them, its tail thumping a happy rhythm against a mahogany table. Mr. Harrison met them at the door, his face transformed. The fear and exhaustion were gone, replaced by a deep, smiling gratitude. He wasn't wearing a suit, but a comfortable sweater. He looked like the kind man Susan had always described. He shook Susan's hand warmly, and then bent down to look Grace in the eye. "It is an honor to finally meet you properly, Miss Riley," he said, his voice full of genuine respect. Dinner was served in a formal dining room, but Mr. Harrison made it feel like a family meal. He asked Grace about school, about her hobbies, about her great-grandfather. Grace, usually shy around strangers, found herself talking easily. She told him about Sergeant Riley's books, his love of codes and patterns, his belief that truth, like a mathematical equation, always had a solution if you just knew how to look for it. As they ate dessert, a rich chocolate cake, Mr. Harrison leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "Grace, I need to be honest with you. What you did in that courtroom, it started a war. Michael Fletcher is not a man who gives up easily. He's cornered, and that makes him dangerous. The man who spoke to you at the courthouse works for him. His name is Julian Vance. He's Fletcher's fixer. He's unpleasant." Susan's hand instinctively found Grace's under the table. "I've already taken precautions," Mr. Harrison continued. "I've hired a private security firm. They'll be watching your house. Discreetly, of course. I don't want to frighten you, but I will not allow you or your mother to be put at risk. You are under my protection now." The relief that washed over Susan was so profound it was visible. The tension in her shoulders eased for the first time in 24 hours. "But there's more," Mr. Harrison said, his eyes on Grace. "The district attorney wants to speak with you. Officially. They need your testimony to build their case against Fletcher. It would mean testifying again, this time in a criminal trial." Grace's stomach twisted into a knot. The thought of facing Fletcher again, of being in that room, under those lights, made her feel cold. But she also knew it was necessary. Fletcher had to be stopped, not just for what he did to Mr. Harrison, but for what he might do to others. "I'll do it," she said, her voice clear and steady. Mr. Harrison nodded slowly, a look of deep admiration in his eyes. "I thought you might say that. You have a spine of steel, young lady, just like your great-grandfather." He then slid a simple, unadorned business card across the table. "This is my personal number. If you see anything suspicious, if anyone approaches you, if you feel even the slightest bit unsafe, you call me. Day or night. Do you understand?" Grace took the card. It felt heavy in her hand. A lifeline. "Yes, sir. I understand." The drive home was different. The city lights seemed a little brighter, the shadows a little less menacing. Knowing that someone was watching over them, that they were no longer alone, was a profound comfort. But as they pulled up to their little house, Grace saw something that made her blood run cold. The front door was slightly ajar. Susan saw it at the same moment. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The security Mr. Harrison had promised wasn't supposed to be obvious. They hadn't even started yet. "Stay in the car," Susan ordered, her voice trembling. "Lock the doors." But Grace was already opening her door. "No, we stay together." Her mother hesitated, then nodded, her face grim. The driver, a large, stoic man named Frank, was already on his phone, speaking in a low, urgent voice. "Sir, we have a situation at the Riley residence. Possible unauthorized entry." He got out of the car, positioning himself between them and the house. "Ma'am, miss, please stay behind me." Together, they approached the house. The familiar wooden door, which should have been a symbol of safety, now seemed like a gaping wound. Frank pushed it open slowly. The living room was dark. Nothing seemed out of place at first. But then, as her eyes adjusted, Grace saw it. One of her great-grandfather's books was lying on the floor. It was his most treasured one, a rare treatise on historical ciphers. It was always kept in a glass case. Now, it lay open, its delicate pages splayed. And on the wall above the empty case, a single message had been scrawled in thick, black marker. It wasn't a long message. It was just 2 words. "I'm watching." The threat was no longer a vague promise whispered in a courthouse hallway. It was here, in their home, in their sanctuary. They had breached the walls. Julian Vance, Fletcher's fixer, had sent his regards. The war Mr. Harrison had spoken of had just arrived on their doorstep. And Grace knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. The battle of wits had just escalated into a war of nerves, and her family was on the front line. Frank, the driver, was already relaying the new information into his phone. "We have a confirmed breach. And a threat." "Yes, sir. I'll secure the perimeter until the team arrives." He turned to Susan and Grace, his professional demeanor a small island of calm in a sea of fear. "Mr. Harrison is on his way, and he's not coming alone." Within minutes, the quiet suburban street was transformed. Two black SUVs, unmarked but official-looking, pulled up silently. Men in dark suits, equipped with earpieces, emerged and began a systematic sweep of the house and yard. They moved with a quiet, efficient professionalism that was both reassuring and terrifying. This was the world Mr. Harrison inhabited, a world of power, of wealth, and of the kind of danger that required teams of trained professionals. Mr. Harrison arrived shortly after, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He bypassed the security team and went straight to Susan and Grace, who were standing on the lawn, wrapped in blankets provided by one of the guards. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice tight with anger and concern. He looked at the defaced wall, his jaw clenching. "This is my fault. I underestimated him. I never should have let you come back here tonight." "It's not your fault," Susan said, though her voice shook. We can't stay here." "No, you can't," Mr. Harrison agreed. "You'll come with me. My house is secure. You'll stay there until this is over. Both of you." It wasn't a request. It was a command born of fierce protectiveness. As one of the security men, a tall man with a calm demeanor named Marcus, came over to report, Grace's eyes were drawn back to the book on the floor. Something was wrong. It wasn't just that it was out of its case. It was the page it was open to. She slipped away from the adults and went to the doorway, peering inside. The page was from a chapter on the Vigenère cipher, a method of encrypting text using a keyword. Her great-grandfather had made copious notes in the margins. But there, at the bottom of the page, was a small, almost invisible mark that hadn't been there before. A tiny pinprick. She remembered one of Sergeant Riley's lessons. He had taught her about steganography, the art of hiding a message in plain sight. "Anyone can write a secret code, Gracie," he had told her. "The real art is in sending a message that no one even knows is a message." Was it possible? Had the intruder left something more than just a crude threat on the wall? It seemed unlikely. This was an act of intimidation, not espionage. But the mark was there. A tiny, deliberate puncture in the paper. Miss Marcus, the head of security, was now beside her. "You shouldn't be in here. We haven't cleared the whole house yet." "The book," Grace said, pointing. "Can you take a picture of that page for me? A close-up of the whole page, including the margins." Marcus looked at her, then at the book, a flicker of professional curiosity in his eyes. He probably thought it was a strange request from a frightened child, a way of coping with the trauma. But he pulled out his phone, stepped carefully into the room, and took several high-resolution photos. "I'll send them to your mother's phone," he said kindly. As they were escorted back to Mr. Harrison's waiting car, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something. The message on the wall was for them, a blunt instrument of fear. But the book felt different. It felt like a message meant for her. And she had a sinking feeling that it wasn't from Michael Fletcher. It was from someone else entirely. Someone who knew who she was. Someone who knew about her great-grandfather. And that, somehow, was an even more frightening thought. The layers of the conspiracy were peeling back, revealing something far more complex and dangerous than a simple case of corporate fraud. Grace Riley had stumbled into a war with more than one front. The guest wing of Mr. Harrison's mansion was larger than their entire house. The beds were soft as clouds, the bathrooms gleaming marble. A kind-faced housekeeper had brought them fluffy robes and warm slippers. Yet, sleep did not come easily to Grace. The image of the black letters scrawled on their living room wall was burned into her mind. "I'm watching." It was a violation, a promise of violence that had shattered their sense of security. Susan was in the adjoining room, and Grace could hear her pacing softly, her own anxieties too sharp for sleep. But for Grace, it wasn't just fear that kept her awake. It was a question. The book. The pinprick. It was a loose thread, and her mind, trained by her great-grandfather, could not let it go. She slipped out of the plush bed, the thick carpet silencing her footsteps. Her mother's phone was on the nightstand, charging. Grace picked it up, her fingers unlocking the screen. Marcus, the security chief, had been true to his word. The high-resolution photos of the book page were there. Grace enlarged the first image, her eyes scanning the familiar text on the Vigenère cipher. It was a complex polyalphabetic substitution cipher, one Sergeant Riley had called the indecipherable cipher for centuries. He had taught her how it worked, how a simple keyword could create a nearly unbreakable code. His handwritten notes filled the margins, equations and observations scrawled in his precise, elegant script. She zoomed in on the bottom of the page, where she had seen the pinprick. There it was, a tiny, perfect hole. It looked like it had been made with the tip of a compass or a very fine needle. It was deliberate. Why? Her heart began to beat a little faster. This wasn't random vandalism. The book had been chosen. The page had been chosen. And the mark had been placed with precision. This was a message. She swiped to the next photo, a wider shot of the entire two-page spread. She scanned it, her eyes tracing the lines of text, the handwritten notes, looking for anything out of place. Nothing. She went over it again, this time slower, more methodically. She thought about her great-grandfather's lessons. Don't look for the message, Gracie. Look for the carrier. The information is always hidden in the container. What was the container here? The book? The page? The notes? Or something else? Her gaze fell on the notes in the margin again. Her great-grandfather had underlined a single sentence in the printed text. The primary weakness of the Vigenère cipher is the repeating nature of its key. Next to it, he had written a short note. Repetition betrays itself. Find the pattern, find the key. Kosciuszki was close, but he missed the music. Kosciuszki examination. Grace knew what that was. A method of attacking the Vigenère cipher by identifying repeated strings of characters, which could reveal the length of the keyword. But what did he mean by the music? She stared at the note, her mind racing. The music. It sounded like a poetic flourish, but her great-grandfather was not a poet. He was a mathematician, a logician. Every word had a purpose. Then she saw it. It wasn't in the note itself, but just below it. A series of tiny, almost invisible dots, written in faded ink, so small they looked like imperfections in the paper. They were not pinpricks, they were drawn. A sequence of 8 dots, arranged in a subtle pattern. They looked like musical notes, but without a staff, just a sequence. Her breath caught in her throat. The intruder hadn't put them there. They were her great-grandfather's. The intruder had simply marked the page, pointing to it, pointing her to this specific note. This changed everything. The message wasn't from Fletcher. Fletcher wouldn't know about this book, this page, these notes. The message was from someone who knew her great-grandfather's work. Someone who knew that she would know where to look. But who? And why? A soft knock came at her door. Grace nearly jumped out of her skin. The door opened a crack, and her mother's worried face appeared. Gracie? Are you okay? I couldn't sleep. I'm okay, Mom, Grace said, her voice a whisper. Come look at this. Susan came and sat on the bed beside her. Grace showed her the photo on the phone, pointing to the tiny dots. Grandpa Thomas put these here, and the person who broke into our house wanted me to find them. Susan squinted at the screen, her brow furrowed in confusion. What are they? I think it's a key, Grace said, her mind working furiously. He wrote about the music. What if he didn't mean it as a metaphor? What if he meant actual music? She thought back to the countless hours she had spent in her great-grandfather's study. He often worked with classical music playing softly in the background. He had a small, old record player and a collection of vinyl records. Mostly Bach, Mozart, and a composer she didn't recognize, an obscure 18th-century musician named Antoine Forqueray. Her great-grandfather had been particularly fond of his work, calling it mathematics set to melody. Could that be it? Could the key to a cipher be hidden in a piece of music? Mom, do you remember Grandpa Thomas's records? Of course, Susan said. They're in the wooden chest at the foot of his bed. What? We need to get them, Grace said urgently. I think there's something in them. A message. The next morning, they found Mr. Harrison in his study, a grand, wood-paneled room lined with books from floor to ceiling. He was on the phone, his voice sharp and commanding. He was talking to the district attorney. When he saw them, he ended the call quickly. "Good morning," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I hope you slept well. The police finished at your house. They found no fingerprints. The intruder was a professional. We need to go back to the house," Grace said, before her mother could stop her. Mr. Harrison raised an eyebrow. "It's still a crime scene, Grace. And it's not safe. We don't need to go inside," Grace explained. "Just to the garage. There's a chest. It has my great-grandfather's old records. I think they're important." She explained her theory about the notes, the phrase, the music, and the composer Forqueray. To her surprise, Mr. Harrison didn't dismiss it as the fantasy of a child. He listened intently, his gaze sharp and focused. When she was finished, he nodded slowly. "Sergeant Thomas Riley," he said, more to himself than to them. "I've heard stories about him. He was a legend in certain circles during the Cold War. A ghost. No one knew what he really did, but they knew he was brilliant." He looked at Grace with a new level of understanding. "It's not just a mind you've inherited, is it? It's a legacy." He picked up his phone. "Marcus," he said, "I need you to escort Susan and Grace to their home. They need to retrieve something from the garage. Secure the area. No one gets within a block of them. And bring the item back here." Immediately, the trip back to their quiet street was like entering a military zone. Unmarked cars were parked at either end of the block. Men in plain clothes spoke into their wrists. It was surreal. Their little corner of the world had become the epicenter of a secret war. Marcus and another guard escorted them to the garage. The wooden chest was just where Grace remembered it, covered in a dusty canvas sheet. It was heavy, but the guards lifted it easily and placed it in the trunk of the SUV. They were back at the mansion within the hour. In the safety of Mr. Harrison's study, they opened the chest. The musty smell of old vinyl and cardboard filled the air. There they were, dozens of records. Grace carefully lifted out the ones by Antoine Forqueray. There were 5 of them. She examined the covers, the liner notes, looking for anything unusual. "What are we looking for?" Susan asked. "A pattern," Grace said, her eyes scanning the track listings. "Something that matches the notes." It took her nearly 20 minutes. She compared the sequence of 8 dots from her great-grandfather's note to the musical notations of the track titles. It was painstaking work. Finally, she found it. On the 3rd record, a piece titled Pieces de Viol, Suite No. 5. The first 8 notes of the second movement, La Leclerc, matched the pattern of the dots. "This is it," she breathed. "This is the music." But what did it mean? Was it just a song? Or was the music itself the key? Mr. Harrison had an old, high-quality record player in his study. He carefully placed the record on the turntable, and the rich, complex sound of a viola da gamba filled the room. The music was beautiful, but also intricate, mathematical. Grace listened, her head tilted, trying to hear what her great-grandfather had heard. It wasn't in the melody. It was something else. She looked at the record spinning, at the needle tracing the grooves. And then she remembered another of his lessons. He had been teaching her about early forms of data storage, about how information could be encoded physically, on punch cards, on magnetic tape, and even, in theory, on a vinyl record. "Stop," she said suddenly. Mr. Harrison lifted the needle. "Look at the record itself," Grace said, pointing. "In the space between the last 2 tracks. There's a scratch." Mr. Harrison and Susan leaned in. It wasn't a normal scratch from a stray needle. It was a series of fine, deliberate etchings in the dead wax near the record's label. They were letters and numbers. A code. It looked like a set of coordinates, followed by a sequence of letters. "Jupiter." "What is it?" Susan asked, her voice a whisper. "It's a location," Mr. Harrison said, his eyes wide. He was already typing the coordinates into his computer. A satellite map appeared on the large screen behind his desk. It showed a remote area in the Appalachian Mountains. And a keyword. Jupiter. The repeating nature of the key. The Vigenère cipher. It all clicked into place. The book. The page. The music. The record. It was a trail of breadcrumbs left by her great-grandfather, a puzzle for her to solve. And the intruder, whoever they were, had known about it. They hadn't come to threaten her. They had come to guide her. To activate her. But why? Mr. Harrison stared at the screen, a grim expression on his face. "This is far bigger than Michael Fletcher in a fraudulent contract," he said, his voice low. "Fletcher is a pawn. A greedy, Foolish man, but a pawn nonetheless. Whatever your great-grandfather was involved in, it's coming to light. And you, Grace, are now at the center of it. The phone on his desk buzzed. It was his head of security. Mr. Harrison listened, his face growing pale. He hung up without saying a word. What is it? Susan asked, her voice trembling. Michael Fletcher was just found dead in his holding cell, Mr. Harrison said, his voice grim. They're calling it a suicide, but there's no doubt in my mind. He was silenced. The room felt suddenly cold. The beautiful, complex music of Forqueray was forgotten. The game had changed. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about secrets. Secrets people were willing to kill for. Secrets that her great-grandfather had hidden away, protected by a key of music and a trail of clues. And Grace was the only one who could follow it. The legacy he had left her wasn't just a sharp mind. It was a dangerous inheritance. The news of Fletcher's death hung in the air of the study, heavy and suffocating. Suicide, they called it. A convenient end to a messy story. But everyone in the room knew it was an execution. A loose end being tied up. It was a message, sent with brutal clarity. We can get to anyone, anywhere. Susan reached for Grace, pulling her close. The world of corporate fraud had been frightening enough. This was something else entirely. This was the world of spies and assassins, a world Grace only knew from her great-grandfather's books. A world that was supposed to be history. They silenced him. Susan whispered, her voice trembling. Robert, what is going on? Who are these people? Mr. Harrison ran a hand over his weary face. I don't know, but Thomas Riley did. This location, he tapped the satellite map on the screen. This is where we'll find our answers. Fletcher was just the tip of the iceberg. We need to find out what he was a part of. His resolve was like iron. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. He had put Grace and her mother in danger, and he would move heaven and earth to get them out of it. Marcus, he said into his intercom, his voice hard as stone. Assemble a team. I want 4 of your best men. We're taking a trip to the mountains, and I want you to find out everything you can about a project or an organization with the codename Jupiter. While the security team mobilized, Grace sat with the record album in her lap. She felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a powerful sense of purpose. This was her legacy, her inheritance. Her great-grandfather hadn't just left her books and puzzles. He had left her a mission. He had trusted that, when the time came, she would be able to finish what he started. She looked at the coordinates on the screen, then at the keyword, Jupiter. A Vigenère key. But what was it meant to decrypt? There had to be a message. The key was useless without the coded text. She thought back to the book. Clause 17b. The fraudulent clause. It was the catalyst for this whole affair. Could it be? Could the message be hidden in the very weapon that was used against Mr. Harrison? It seemed too audacious, too poetic. But Sergeant Riley was a man who appreciated the poetry of espionage. Hiding a secret in plain sight was his specialty. Mr. Harrison, she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Can you bring the contract back up on the screen? The full document. He looked at her, a question in his eyes, but he did as she asked. The 47-page document appeared, a dense wall of text. What are you looking for, Grace? A message, she said simply. She walked up to the large monitor, her small finger tracing the lines of legal jargon. The key is Jupiter. Now we need to find the lock. For the next hour, Grace worked with a focus that was unnerving in a child. With Mr. Davies, the lawyer, on speakerphone, she explained what she needed. She had him isolate the text of the entire contract into a single block, stripping out all formatting. Then, using an online Vigenère decryption tool, she applied the keyword Jupiter. The first few attempts yielded nothing but gibberish. The key was right, but the source text was wrong. It's not the whole contract, she murmured, chewing on her lip. It's something specific, something they wouldn't think to change. She remembered her great-grandfather's lesson. The devil is in what the details are trying to hide. Try just the metadata, she instructed the lawyer. The file information, the author fields, the revision notes, everything that isn't part of the main text. Mr. Davies was skeptical, but he copied the block of metadata and pasted it into the decryption tool. He applied the key, and then he went silent. Mr. Davies? Mr. Harrison prompted. What is it? My God. The lawyer's voice was a choked whisper. It's a list, not of names, but of accounts. offshore bank accounts, dozens of them, and dates, transactions. It looks like a ledger, a secret ledger for a massive money laundering operation. He paused, and there's a note at the end. It says, Jupiter Initiative funding complete. Phase 2 authorized. Target, U.S. financial infrastructure. Asset, M. Fletcher. The room was silent. The truth was more horrifying than they could have imagined. Fletcher wasn't just a scam artist. He was the financial arm of a domestic terror group. The $750 million he was trying to steal from Mr. Harrison wasn't just for personal greed. It was seed money, the funding for an attack on the country itself. And the intruder, the person who had led Grace to this discovery, was not a friend. They were a whistleblower, a ghost in the machine, trying to stop a catastrophe. They couldn't go to the authorities because they didn't know who they could trust. The Jupiter Initiative sounded official, powerful. It was likely they had people on the inside. So they had turned to the one person who could solve the puzzle. The heir to Thomas Riley. The trip to the Appalachian Mountains was executed with military precision. Mr. Harrison chartered a private jet. Grace and Susan were surrounded at all times by the quiet, watchful presence of Marcus and his team. Grace spent the flight studying the satellite maps of the coordinates. It was a remote location, deep in a national forest. No roads, no buildings. Just a rocky outcrop on the side of a mountain. When they arrived, a pair of rugged jeeps were waiting. The drive was long and jarring, up winding dirt roads that eventually disappeared altogether. They spent the last hour hiking, the air growing thin and cold. Grace, small and nimble, led the way, a compass in her hand. Her great-grandfather had taught her how to read a map, how to navigate by the sun and stars. She felt his presence with every step, a steadying hand on her shoulder. Finally, they reached the spot. It was just as the map had shown. A flat, windswept ledge of rock overlooking a vast, green valley. There was nothing there. No sign that anyone had ever stood in this spot before. Are you sure this is it? Marcus asked, his men already fanning out, securing the perimeter. Grace didn't answer. She was scanning the rock face, her eyes looking for a pattern. Her great-grandfather was a man of precision. He would not have chosen a random spot. There was a reason they were here. She ran her hand over the cold, rough stone. And then she felt it. A small, almost imperceptible indentation. Not natural. It was carved. A symbol. It was a simple circle with a stylized bird, a raven, inside it. It's his mark, Grace whispered. It was the same mark he used to sign his private journals. She examined the rock around the symbol. She pushed. She pulled. Nothing. It was solid stone. She was missing something. She closed her eyes, trying to think like him. The music. The key. Repetition betrays itself. Repetition. She looked at the symbol again. The raven. Her great-grandfather had a favorite poem, one he had made her memorize as a child. Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. He loved the poem's structure, its relentless, repeating refrain, nevermore. She looked at Marcus. I need a hammer and a chisel. And I need you to tap the rock, right here. She pointed to a spot just below the symbol. I need you to tap it in a rhythm. A short tap, then a long one. Short, long. Short, long. Morse code for the letter O. Marcus looked at Mr. Harrison, who simply nodded. The big security man took the tools and began to tap. The sound echoed across the silent valley. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low grinding sound, a section of the rock face receded, revealing a dark, square opening. A hidden compartment. Inside was a heavy, steel lockbox. It was old, but clearly military-grade. Marcus lifted it out. There was no keyhole, only a simple combination lock with 5 dials, each with the letters of the alphabet. Now what? Susan asked, her voice hushed with awe. Grace looked at the box. 5 letters. She thought of the poem again, of its most famous line, and she smiled. This was her great-grandfather's final test. A flourish of literary flair at the end of a lifetime of logic and numbers. She stepped forward and turned the dials. Q, U, O, T, H, quoth the raven, nevermore. With a loud click, the lock disengaged. Inside the box, nestled in faded velvet, was not a weapon or a pile of documents. It was a single, small, leather-bound book, a diary. And on the first page, in her great-grandfather's familiar, elegant script, were the words, My dearest Grace, if you are reading this, then the world is in more trouble than I had feared, and I am no longer there to protect it. I have failed, but I have not left you unprepared. The truth is a weapon. This book is your armory. Trust no one but yourself, and the good man who I hope is standing beside you. His name is Robert Harrison. I saved his father's life in the war. He is a man of honor. The enemies we fought did not vanish. They simply went into the shadows. They call themselves Jupiter now. This book contains their true names, their plans, their history. It is everything you need to bring them into the light. Your fight is now. Be brave, my little songbird. Your grandfather is always with you. Grace looked up, tears blurring her vision. She looked at Mr. Harrison, whose face was a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. She looked at her mother, whose pride and love shone brighter than any fear. The story ends there, but it also begins there. It begins on a lonely mountaintop where a young girl accepts a sacred trust. It begins with the revelation that a corporate scam was merely the prologue to a war for a nation's soul. It is a story about the legacies we inherit and the choices we make that define our own. You've been there, haven't you? You've felt the weight of a responsibility you did not ask for, but knew you could not refuse. You've had a truth placed in your hands, a truth so heavy it felt like it might crush you, while the world around you remained blissfully unaware. You've seen the hidden connections between small acts of greed and great acts of evil. You've felt the frustration of knowing a threat is real, while others dismiss your fears. Grace's story is a reminder that the greatest strength doesn't have to come with age or power. It comes from clarity. It comes from courage. It's about having the courage to pick up the weapon of truth, even when your hands shake, even when you're facing down an enemy hidden in the highest echelons of power. It's a story that proves that one small voice, armed with the truth, can be louder than an army of lies. You weren't wrong to believe that something was hidden beneath the surface. The truth was always there. You just needed the key to unlock it. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.